Greetings, it's Terry at Cottage in the Court. We're in that month of love, that month of February where, at least on the 14th, we are supposedly buying gifts, bringing flowers, ordering chocolates for that person that we love. In my opinion, you should show the person that you love them 365 days a year, just like you should love yourself. If you want to think of something that's unique to buy or to help create with the person that you love, that they would be able to actually use 365 days a year, have you considered a she shed or a he shed? I'm thinking a she shed would totally blow someone's socks off, especially because we're home trying to be safe. I recently wrote about she sheds on my blog. You might want to pop over there and read my thoughts on she sheds from a book I recently read. In the meantime, I've got a wonderful guest today. Her grandfather built her grandmama a she shed back in the day, and it's still standing today, and it's actually historical. Allow me to introduce you to Shawn Spencer. She's going to share a little history, a little family fun, and facts about the Ann Spencer Garden. Hi, Shawn Spencer. How are you doing today?
Hi, Terry. I'm doing wonderful. How are you today?
Absolutely wonderful. Shawn, tell us a little bit about who you are and who your grandmother is.
Well, I would not be unless my grandmother was. I am the granddaughter of Ann Spencer, who's a poet, an American poet associated with the Harlem Renaissance, and also an avid gardener and a social activist and a librarian and a wife and a mother and a grandmother. And she kind of got associated with the Harlem Renaissance by being a social activist. And in her home, my grandparents' home on Pier Street, 1313 Pier Street in Lynchburg, and people in the community, people like Mary Rice Hayes, decided that they wanted to organize and establish the NAACP branch in Lynchburg. So Mary Hayes, or Mary Rice Hayes, who's another brilliant woman. She and my grandmother were really best friends, but these were two African-American women who went door to door asking people to give up a penny, a nickel, a dime, which was a lot of money then, to join the NAACP branch. This is starting in Lynchburg around 1911. And of course, this NAACP branch was to give this group a voice and to give them power collectively. And because they were living in Lynchburg, and Lynchburg was probably no different than any other place in the country, especially larger cities, where African Americans were coming into their own, wanted their own, owning their own homes and building their own homes maybe, and coming out of the fields and becoming professionals. But these two women kind of started this movement. Mm-hmm. And so Mary was the secretary. So she writes up to New York to W.E.B. Du Bois and asks about forming this branch. And Du Bois writes back and says, yes, we would, love for you to have this branch. I'll send down a field secretary. He also notices my grandmother's papers and poetry and things around the house, and he inquires with my grandmother about whose poetry this is, and she says it's hers. And from that time on, she and James Weldon Johnson became best of friends. And not only the two of them, but also my grandfather and James Weldon Johnson's wife, Grace Nell, became best couple friends, I guess you would call them. And so it's kind of James Weldon Johnson is really, we think, the glue that connected Ann Spencer to Harlem without ever living in Harlem. And then somehow, in various ways, of course, Ann Spencer meets W.E.B. Du Bois through the founding of the NAACP, but there are many others who are associated with this group. So very often, as they're traveling through the South and somewhere near Lynchburg, they would stop over. There's telegrams, there's letters saying, oh, I'm going to be coming through, I'll be there on such a day, and making arrangements to come and to go and things like that. So that's Ann Spencer, just a little bit of Ann Spencer, but she publishes during that period. She's also associated with another Harlem Renaissance contributor who is living here in Lynchburg, a man named Sterling A. Brown. Sterling A. Brown graduates from 2 Ivy League schools, white schools, one black, one white. And his father is, as a matter of fact, was involved with Howard University. Well, Sterling A. Brown needed this teaching experience, and so he ends up coming to Lynchburg and teaching at the Virginia Seminary and Theological College, and becomes quite known as the professor there. Well, Sterling A. Brown learns about Ann Spencer because the Virginia Seminary and Theological College is where she graduated. It's where, as a matter of fact, where she meets my grandfather. And so they're involved in the Virginia Seminary. But this young Sterling A. Brown, there's letters from him talking about how he would come to see my grandmother almost every evening after teaching at the seminary. And because he knew that she was going to have the newest book published, African-American book, any African-American newspaper, she had always had them all delivered to the house. And so he would spend the evening with them, and they would, talk about literature, or talk about what was in the news, or talk about movements, things that they wanted to do together. But it was where Sterling A. Brown really got inspired about a lot of his poetry that you read in Southern Roads, his book about the dialect of the Southerners, because Sterling A. Brown was from Washington, D.C., although it's kind of South, but it's not South, it's not like Lynchburg, Virginia. Mm-hmm. So they became really good friends. But my grandmother was quite the woman before her time here in Lynchburg. She even, we're talking about before 1920, she's refusing to take public transportation because it got just to be too much for her. And what I mean by that was she wasn't moving to go to the back of the trolley. And there was an incident where the driver wanted her to move to the back of the trolley, and she refused. And so she ends up having to go to the superintendent's office so that her husband could come and collect her there.
Oh, Lord.
And so that was the end of it. And not only for her, she came home and she told my father and my 2 aunts that they were forbidden to ride public transportation as well, which meant that they had to walk all over town as well. What my grandmother would do, instead, if she wasn't walking, she'd hitch a ride on the back of a farmer's wagon. And she said that was just she really enjoyed that, and she said it was she and the farmers could exchange what they were going to plant. They exchanged seeds. She learned a lot from them. But she was the librarian here in Lynchburg, the African American librarian, and the wife of Edward Spencer, who was a very well respected African American man in the city, who was a parcel postman. And here's his wife wearing pants, as a matter of fact. And that was kind of
risque.
It was very,
Mm-hmm.
so she was her own woman, and she lived by the own beat of her drum.
Why do you think she had this fiery spirit?
I think she always had that fiery spirit. I think she was always independent. Her father, my grandmother talked about her father. Well, she grew up around adults. She was an only child, but that her father, she said, always spoke that she had a huge vocabulary at 3 years old. I don't know. I can't say where this fiery spirit came from, but it was, a little story about Edward and my grandmother when they were at the Virginia Seminary. And my grandmother was one of the youngest children at the seminary at the time. So if you can imagine, the Virginia Seminary is the first opportunity for these African American people to be freely educated.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a group of people there that are like my grandmother, who was 11 years old when she was enrolled there. And then there's my grandfather, who is 7 years older than she. But for them, they're still this first time that they're being freely educated. And, it's, when my grandmother was enrolled there, it took her a few years to kind of get a grasp on things, because she was really self-taught by her mother, who refused to put her in a one-room schoolhouse in West Virginia because she didn't want her daughter to go to school with the mining children. So there was still this caste system even amongst, the blacks.
Yeah.
And so when Edward was courting my grandmother, it took him some nerve to get up to court her. So he sends her passes her a letter in one of their classes they had together. And I don't know what the letter said, something about, would you meet me at the well or something,
Uh-huh.
and, or, kind of, would you go out with me, kind of. And she takes that piece of paper and she writes her response, which is 2 words. And the response is try. And she signs it Huzzy.
Oh.
And I think what that letter shows is my grandmother's fiery spirit. It shows her wit. It shows her sense of humor and her personality, even at 16 years old, 15 or 16 years old, when she receives this letter. But Edward didn't give up. He they ended up marrying, and he knew exactly who he was marrying. There were no surprises, and that was the woman that he fell in love with and built this wonderful home, which is now a Virginia Historic Landmark and on the National Register, and built this beautiful garden, which is the only known restored garden of an African American in the United States.
That's what I was going to ask you. That is the one, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, that's the, when I say that, it's not something that I'm really proud of. I mean, in a sense, because I know that there are other African American gardens, but they're lost. And just like this one would have been lost,
Right.
If it had not been, restored, or if people hadn't come together and made this a Virginia Historic Landmark. But, these African American gardens were lost to, revitalization, urban planning, which is the first thing, to cut off and cut out. Uh, but, I keep looking that there's going to be somebody else that's going to restore an African American garden. When the Hillside Garden Club really was with Jane Baber White, when she brought the Hillside Garden Club, which is a Virginia garden club, to restore this garden. My grandmother's garden was overgrown. She hadn't tended her garden since the 60s. My grandfather died in 64, and my grandmother died in 75. The garden was restored in 83. So it was very overgrown. We moved to Virginia and Lynchburg in 77 and lived in the house for 1 year until my parents purchased the house across the street. So I remember my brothers, trying to, they would cut the grass and try to clip the boxwoods, but they weren't gardeners.
Right.
They were grass cutters.
Yeah.
You know, but so when the Hillside Garden Club came in to restore this garden, Jane White was the leader on the project, and she said that she could see, you could still see the walkways, you could still see pieces of the arbors and the pergolas. You could still see roses trying to find some sun. You could still see the bones of it. And so what they did was they brought in a bulldozer, a small bulldozer, and just kind of took the shovel, the bulldozer, I don't know, it's called the bulldozer shovel, and just kind of softly shook it out, and whatever they could salvage, my grandmother's bulbs and flowers and plants, they took all of those out and put them in holding beds in their own gardens over the winter, and brought them, and then laid out, re-laid out the walkways, and then brought them back in. And so there are many things in the garden today that were originally Ann Spencer's. All of her roses, as a matter of fact, were one of the things that she favored. And there are things that pop up in that garden that we know are hers, but it's like, where did that come from?
Wow.
Beautiful things that are hers. But the arbors and the pergolas, Edward originally constructed out of recycled materials that he found along his postal route. Somebody had discarded. Turnposts that would have held up somebody's house or front porch are now holding up the cottage Eden Crawl, and that was what they named their garden, Eden Crawl.
Yeah.
And they took their two names, Edward, E-D, and Ann, A-N. It's kind of like a pun on the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
And added crawl, which is a South African word that means enclosure or place. And so it's Ed and Ann's place.
Wow.
And they tended to that garden, the two of them. Mostly just the two of them. My grandmother every day was in that garden.
Did she document where she got her plant material from at all?
Yeah,
that was a labor of love for the Hillside Garden Club.
Absolutely. And this is 83, and they're still maintaining that garden in 2020.
That's amazing.
Probably a few generations of ladies that knew nothing about African-American woman named Ann Spencer, knew nothing about the African-American history that their home, the neighborhood that their home is in. So, they really crossed the line to learn about, the full history of, what we're talking about today, the full history of America.
Yeah. Do they walk there? Are they really all in the neighborhood? Or?
The ladies at the Hillside Garden Club,
Mm-hmm.
No, they don't live in the neighborhood. None of them that I know of live in the neighborhood. They drive there. But they have work days, and they come and they work in that garden on those work days once a month or every quarter, whatever it is, however they set it up. And they do all the fundraising, the arbor and the pergola. The restoration of that project was over $100,000. They raised all of that money for the restoration. Anything to stay in the garden. So that's, it takes a a lot off of the Answers for Moral Foundation of not having to find funds to preserve that.
So do you have poetry readings there? Do you have small events in the garden? Do you tour the house? What goes on there?
Oh, we're open. Well, before the COVID-19, we were open from Garden Day, which usually in Lynchburg, the Virginia Garden Day was the third Tuesday of April. And that was our opening day. And we would be open until the end of October. And so we would close for the winter. During that time of the year, we would have tours, and I would do just about all the tours.
Wow.
House, museum, and the garden. But we would also have fun activities. We'd have poetry readings, which we also partnered with other nonprofit here in Lynchburg named The Listening Group, which is a young group of poets and writers and artists that perform. And we would have those events. We have the Pierce Street Harlem Renaissance Festival, which was in the summer. And we had weddings in the garden.
Wow.
Oh, we had, people that just rented the gardens for picnics. We are part of the Lynchburg Public Gardens system, even though it is at a private nonprofit. And we made that decision to be part of that public gardens because my grandparents opened their garden to anybody who wanted to come. And so we wanted to stay in that spirit. And so it's still open. We never closed during the COVID-19, the garden. Mm-hmm. So you can come anytime, sunrise to sunset. We have Wi-Fi in the garden, so you can stay connected to the world. And there's beautiful places to sit and just to be quiet if you want to. We have people that during graduation season, they come and take their graduation photos there. They take bridal photos there. They take, they come and bring a blanket and a basket and have a picnic there. There's artists that set up easels there. There's musicians that come and play music there. There was one day I walked down to the garden and there was a young man serenading his girlfriend at the pond with a guitar. It's just a beautiful place to come. It's in the inner city, and it's really kind of unique because, we're in a neighborhood, and there's a street that runs behind the garden, but somehow when you get there, it's kind of like you're just somewhere else, but you're just like right off of 29 South and North.
Wow, that's it's a real garden then, because
yeah.
You should get lost in the garden.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that is too cool. So wait, you said it's in the inner city and there's a pond?
Yeah, there's a pond. There's one pond that remains in the garden. There used to be 3 ponds in the garden. So when they restored the garden, they closed up. I think one of the ponds I remember was already closed up near the Eden Crawl, but they closed. There used to be a pond underneath the pergola, and they closed that one up. So, but the remaining pond is still there at the very end, and that's the one that Edward originally built. It's handmade pond. We're still using his engineered underground water system to feed water to that pond.
The discovery of all this had to be amazing, because I'm sure there are things that you found interesting at this stage in your life versus when you were a child.
Yeah, well, pretty much the garden is how as far as the structures in that pond, other than the pond that was under the pergola, which is gone. That's what I remember. But the pond that we would go to the most is a pond that still exists today, and that's the one. And there's a bus there that's named Prince Ebo, and he spits water out of his mouth. And as kids, we were always trying to. There's a fountain in the middle of the pond, and my grandfather had an old shower head, like out of your shower from your bathroom, which is now, kind of refined a little bit, but it still has that look of a shower head. But that was our thing, to try to stand at the edge of the pond and reach, touch the fountainhead without falling in. But that's still there. But the head that I'm talking about, Prince Ebo, was given to my grandparents from W.E.B. Du Bois from Ghana. And so that's still there. There's a concrete bench that my grandfather built, that he hand formed there. It's amazing to me that those things are still there. They're like the bench didn't crack. They break and fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful.
I can't wait to come down and visit. And it's open 6 days a week, 7 days a week.
5 days a week, sunrise to sunset. You just park on Pierce Street and you follow the driveway down, the brick driveway down, and there's a sign that says garden entrance, and you walk across the blue stone pavers. The blue stone pavers take you into the beautiful robin's egg blue wooden gate and lattice gate and fence that my grandfather recycled from the house when they enclosed the sun porch. They didn't do the thing. So it's Pierce Street it was a Confederate camp known as Camp Davis. And when the Civil War ended, it was abandoned. And by around 1870, a neighborhood started growing out of that land. And mostly an African-American neighborhood started growing out of that land. And so within the Pierce Street, there are 2 blocks which is a historic district. And we have, I think, 9 or 10 historic markers, Virginia historic markers, noting these African-American people who made contributions not only to the Commonwealth of Virginia, but to the United States and some beyond. Not, of course, Ann Spencer for her literature, but also people like Amelia Pride, who started the Dorchester House for ex-colored slave women. These were a home for women who had been enslaved all of their lives. And at the end of slavery, they had no place to go. They had no family. So they started a home for them there on Pierce Street. And then Amelia Pride went on and started a cooking school and sewing school for young girls. And then there's a marker for CWC, who was the first African-American vice mayor here in Lynchburg, and also a very well-liked principal at our all-Black Dunbar High School, named after Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And then also for my dad, Chauncey Spencer, who was a Tuskegee Airman and an early Black aviator. And also for Frank Trigg, who was a young man who was born in the governor's mansion in Virginia, in Richmond, and lost his arm in an accident and ended up become educated and became president of 2 or 3 colleges, one Eastern Shore of Maryland. And then in that same house where Frank Trigg lived, after he moved to Maryland, there was a man named Whirlwind Johnson, Dr. Whirlwind Johnson, Robert Whirlwind Johnson. And he was the first African-American physician to practice at our Lynchburg Hospital at the time. Today it's known as Centra. But in the summers, he taught tennis to young African-American children. Well, 2 of those tennis players went on to become world known, Althea Gibson and Arthur Ashe.
Oh my goodness.
He played tennis right here on Pierce Street. So, and there's other people, but like Polly Wheat Maloney, and it's just, an amazing. So we have the most historic highway markers within these 2 blocks of Pierce Street that are no place else, no more markers within these 2 blocks within the whole Commonwealth of Virginia. We have the most. And we keep adding because there's more and more people that we want to acknowledge and to give credit to.
So is, of course, Black History Month, is that a big deal down there? Or do they celebrate this history during the festival on Pierce Street?
Yeah, that's kind of where the festival came about, that was our way through the Ann Spencer Memorial Foundation to educate people in our community of African American heritage there. It doesn't matter how many times the people read it in a newspaper or see it in a newspaper or hear it on the television. There's people that still come to me today that says, I never knew about Ann Spencer, and I lived here all of my life. Well, we get so much coverage here in Lynchburg, through the newspapers and radios and magazines, and not just Lynchburg, nationally and internationally as well. That how people don't know, it just amazes me, especially living here. So, it's just like a commercial. You just have to keep at it and keep sharing the story with people, because, it's not about that they don't see it or hear it. They have to have a connection to it. So if you just keep saying it, eventually maybe you'll make a connection. There'll be something. There'll be, Ann Spencer, through her gardening or through her social activism or through her librarian or through her literature, or through this fine home, this beautiful home that they have, and through the collection of things. You just never know what's going to get people's interest.
Right.
And this is a great time to share African American history. People are interested in learning about what they didn't learn about in high school, that they didn't learn about, especially educated people who went on who are in college and master's and doctor's degrees, who don't know anything about African American history. So it's a good time to share, and it's a good time to learn and listen.
And a whole street. That's what amazes me. When I read that, it was like, whoa, that's interesting. And they're embracing it. It's not hidden. It's not a little tiny plaque. It's an embracing of the history of place.
Yes.
And restoration of a beautiful place that belonged to an African American person that participated in American history.
Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, my father, I'm one of 8 children, and in our house, if we would come home and we would say, Susie, Susie, the white girl or the black girl, my father he'd be in another room and he would come and he would say, now, isn't there a way that you can talk about Susie without saying whether she's white or black? Does it really matter whether she's white or black? And so, we were raised to be American. It wasn't, identifying somebody through color, because that's not who they are.
Right.
But it's really difficult, and it was difficult growing up that way, because, America didn't see us as American.
Right.
But my grandmother believed that, and that's where my father was raised, in that same way, to be American. Even though we have a rich African American history, it's not that we don't hold up the Black Power sign,
Right.
And embrace that.
Right.
But
you were raised to be people.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
Is there a specific saying or poem or a few words that you can leave us with that you remember your grandmother saying?
Yeah, my grandmother would say to us kids, particularly, she would always say, there were a couple of things. She would, if we asked her, what does such and such mean? She always had a big dictionary next to her chair. And she would say, well, come over here and look it up. But she also said, to stand straight, put your shoulders back, enunciate, and be proud of who you are.
That's true. That's true. Well, I can't wait to get down there and walk on Pierce Street in the step of some great people and to touch something in your grandmama's house, because Ann Spencer's awesome.
Well, the neat thing about my grandmother's house, and it's a house museum, and there are no velvet ropes, there's no glass cases. It is as if they just walked out. My grandfather is on his postal route, and my grandmother is at the library, and then they'll be home at 4 o'clock or 5. But the collection is 90% original. Her chairs, and we have the collection of furniture. We have the collection of clothing, jewelry. Her perfume is still on the dresser. So you talk about coming to touch something, and that's something that I was working on incorporating into the museum, of making, having a few things in the museum that people could actually touch, making it more of a kind of, hands-on kind of thing.
Yeah.
There are still chairs that we sit on, and we have, when people come to visit, I'll say, sit down, have a seat.
Wow.
That's where my grandmother sat, or it could be where James Weldon Johnson sat, or it could be where W.E. Du Bois sat. So you really get a sense of how they lived, and the people that were coming in and out of the home.
And the best book that we could read that really shares the real story of Ann Spencer would be what?
Would be Time's Unfading Garden, The Life and Poetry of Ann Spencer, written by Dr. J. Lee Green. It was published in 1977. I believe it was the, can't remember the press. I want to say Louisiana Press. But that book is now out of print, but you can still find those books online sometimes, depending. Some of them are autographed by various people that those books, would have been given to. Somebody told me they even got one with my dad's signature in it. But some could be, up in price depending. But I would, no matter what the condition is, whether it's, somebody used it as a college reference and it could be marked in, I would buy that book in a minute, because I consider that the Ann Spencer Holy Grail.
Yeah.
There's been some other books have been published since that, out of the museum, which is Half My World, which is really a study on the garden, an early study on the garden, and that was done in the 90s. But Jane Baber White, who was a member of this Hillside Garden Club, who took up the restoration, she published another book about the garden, which kind of brings you more up to date with the restored arbors and pergolas. It's a great book, and that book is Lessons Learned from a Poet's Garden. That one is also out of print. These books, when they come off the press, they don't last long, and there's not large printings of them. So that's another. The book, there's also a book of poetry that was published in the early 2000s, around 2002, which is All How Poets Sing and Die, which is written by Nina Salmon, which is some of Ann Spencer's poetry. It's a nice little collection of Ann Spencer's poetry and a little biography as well. But you can also visit our website, AnnSpencerMuseum.com. And you can purchase some of these books online, other than Times of Fading Garden and Lessons Learned, I believe, which is out of print. But some of the other books are still available to purchase from the museum. And just visit the website, because you can get a lot of information about Ann Spencer. There's some great vintage photographs of the garden, of what it looked like back in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And there's some poetry, and email me from that website as well, and I'll answer all of my emails eventually.
Yeah. Well, if you're doing tours and making sure everything stays on track, you're a little bit busy, but we might just take you up on that.
I would love to. I'd love to. Once we get back to we're not gonna open the House Museum for the year. We're gonna keep it closed until next year, but we will be back in full swing as long as we stay on the progressing with the COVID-19. We'll be back open next April for Garden Day.
Okay.
Come and visit the garden. You come visit the garden anytime you want to.
Okay, because that's historic Virginia Garden Week when your house is open, right?
Yes.
That's what I thought. I used to be a Virginia gardener, so I'm very familiar with that week.
Yeah. I think Virginia is unique in that way that they have a whole week that you can visit statewide various gardens.
Yep. And wouldn't it be nice if there was just one more garden that had been restored, an African American garden that have been restored to resemble its original state. How amazing would that be?
Yeah. And really, I mean, a lot of, what was really helpful for the garden club when they were restoring this garden was that we had vintage photographs of plantings and of the structures, because there was just remnants of them. So we have these photographs that were very helpful in the restoration in the preservation of it. So, just, if there's people out there who know that there was a garden, but, it's gone, there's some pictures somewhere. So it's not lost hope that it can be restored.
Well, thank you for your insight. When I come down, I will be taking pictures in the garden, and it would be an honor for me to really physically meet with you and just share with you my thanks for your grandmother's presence in my world.
So I would love to have you, and I definitely will be there when you come.
Okay.
And give you a sneak peek. And also, give a sneak peek. We didn't talk about Ann Spencer's cottage. She has her cottage down in the garden as well. Her writing studio that Edward built for her in the 1920s.
Oh my. Oh my.
So she had a she shed before there was a she shed.
I was getting ready to say that. A she shed?
Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
my.
Yeah.
Now, are her works still in there as well?
Her desk, her chair, all of her papers are held at the University of Virginia in the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library. So her papers are all stored there. But there are photographs on all the walls of the cottage, because that's how she didn't like to keep a lot of photographs in the house. So she would have them hung up on the wall, and every visit we would come, we would have, of course, a new school picture for our Dranny, and she'd give us a thumbtack, and we would go and thumbtack it onto the wall. So there's pictures of me as a little girl, and my cousins and brothers and family members. It's mostly family and just close friends that are pictured in there. But it's beautiful. You see all these. You can go on when you go to the website. I think there's a picture of it.
Mm-hmm. But not the inside.
Yeah, there's pictures of the inside.
The whole inside?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. When you started this journey, did you find a pen that you had seen her write with, or a pencil?
Oh yeah.
Feel special?
Plenty of little pencils. She would, she had pencil sharpeners, so she would write with pencils that were like 3 inches, just 3 inches long. So yeah, there's still some of those around. Oh, we still have those sitting like by her table, her eyeglasses, her coffee cup, her shoes, her perfume. Every once in a while I'll spray a little bit of her perfume in her bedroom.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait. Well, thank you so much. And you will see me soon.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Wow. As I have said many times before, I love a good story, especially when it involves the garden. Thank you, Sean, for taking a little time and sharing your grandma with me. April can't come soon enough, and I'm really looking forward to visiting the Ann Spencer Garden this year. Speaking of April, Ann Spencer actually wrote a poem called Another April. She is too weak to tend her garden last year, this year and old. The plants know and cluster, running free. The wisteria, purple and white, leaps from tree to martin box, dragged down by globes of the fragrant wet petals to shore up strengthens the vine, then drops to touch earth, to shoot up again, looping, hanging, peeling out, April again. April is here, and the window from which she stares needs washing. Now, I don't know how Ann Spencer would have read that poem, but I did the best I could. And I love her words. I love her words. I can't say that enough. I ask that you continue to follow me. My website, cottageinthecourt.com. Instagram and Twitter, Cottage in Court. Facebook, Cottage in the Court. And I occasionally write on Medium. I hope that this little chat with Sean Spencer will inspire you to visit the Ann Spencer house, to help us uncover more African American historical gardens that might have been lost along the way. In the meantime, garden with a passion. Garden like you mean it. The garden has been there for us, and she continues to be there for us. Enjoy the week.